All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about technical debt, and we're going to talk about some tools and a way that you can approach eliminating technical debt in your environment. But first, let's talk about your environment, because I know Craft is a cutting-edge conference. Some of the smartest people, the most advanced engineers are here today, so let's talk about your environment a little bit. You might be using infrastructure as code. You have a document that defines your infrastructure. You could run it through Terraform or something like that. And the next thing you know, you've got VMs that are running in the cloud. You might be using configuration management, Ansible, Chef, Puppet. You just type a couple lines of code and a role for your server is immediately defined, very dependably, very reliably. You might be using continuous integration, where you just submit your code to GitHub and then automatically from a webhook, it gets submitted for unit testing, the Docker image is built, and oh yeah, by the way, you're running Docker images and application containers in production. You guys are really sharp. But now, some of us also here at this conference, maybe we're doing it a little bit different. Maybe we're still manually racking and provisioning our servers. We're even putting the DVD into the CD drive or the disk drive, and we're clicking OK to do the install. Maybe we already have servers, but when we're doing the role for that server, we're still clicking OK, OK, or next, 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 OK. And maybe when we submit our code, it has to go through some convoluted process of check-in, verification, maybe Q&A. Hey, is this the daily one? Is this the other one? Somebody has to check off or sign off on it, and then finally we can get to production maybe after we do some sort of other test. Now, if you're in this second group, you might be wondering, well, hey, there's a lot of this other new stuff that's going on. I've been hearing about it in podcasts. I've been reading about it in the media, on Twitter, and so on. How do we modernize our processes? Hello, my name is Michael Jenkins, and I'm a senior systems engineer. I've been working for about 20 years doing process automation and system administration. I've worked for startups, I've worked for small businesses, and also Fortune 500 companies. And through this time and these changes, these different roles, there's only one thing that's been constant. Can anybody guess what it is? It's change. In IT, you can't expect to work without knowing that things are going to change. Well, you might be saying, well, what's going to change? I mean, I'm in IT, big deal, whatever. Well, our operating systems change. Maybe you started off learning Windows, and now you're using Linux. Maybe even after you got into Linux, you started off on CentOS because it's free, it's open source, and then you got into the enterprise and you started using Red Hat. Or maybe even the same thing with Debian and Ubuntu and so on. Or maybe if you're more on the development side, you started off with a programming language. Perl is my native language. But as the years have gone on and technologies and approaches have changed, maybe you've also changed languages. C#, Python, Ruby, Java, and so on. Or better yet, you're using Go now because everybody's using Go. If you're coding anything, you got to code in Go, right? So yeah, our programming languages are just another example of change. And probably one of the biggest changes that we're going through right now in the past few years has been this move to the cloud. Businesses aren't hosting their own data centers on site anymore. They're using Google Cloud or Amazon or Microsoft to host their compute infrastructure elsewhere, so they don't have to manage that. So now, okay, here's another look at it. We can still ask the question, how do we modernize our processes? My operating systems are changing, my programming methods and approaches and frameworks and languages are changing, even my data centers, my compute infrastructure is changing, and maybe I'm behind the game in that. How can I modernize or change what I'm doing? So before I give you a couple tools that you can use, I have to say that one size does not fit all. You know your teams, you know your company, you know your approach, you know the work that you're doing, and I think this tool will be useful for you. However, you may have to tailor it to the environment that you're working in. I'm not going to say that this is a silver bullet to solve everybody's problems, but it's an idea, it's a start that you can use to make change. Okay, 3 steps. The first one we're going to look at is building a business case. As we talk about building our business case, we're going to focus on the pain points. We're going to focus on what's important. Second, we're going to share and collaborate. And as we share and collaborate, we're going to try to form alliances. After we kind of get a team together, then we're going to start easing into the change. And even as we do that, we're going to start small. Okay, so we've got our toolbox. We're just about ready to go. Let's dive a little bit deeper into each one of these steps. Okay, first off, building a business case. A business case is nothing more than a reason why you should be doing something for your company, for your business. Primarily, you want to ask and answer a couple questions. What's the main problem? What's the pain point? What do we need to focus on? And why should we be doing something about that? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You might also want to focus on in your business case, what exactly needs to change? How will a new tool or a new process help the situation that we're trying to focus on? And this one's a kind of a touchy one because I know as engineers, we like to, like I said, we're reading about the latest and greatest in software and technology, and we want to use that right away. We want to, download the latest open source tool and immediately get that working in production. Maybe even that tool's not useful, so we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And finally, what baseline and metrics can we use to validate the change? This is an important step because how can you even judge that the work, the effort, the time that you're putting into making a change is even applicable, that it's even valid? So you need to determine a baseline and some metrics that you can gauge any improvement that you've been able to achieve. Now, as I share this with people, developers and system administrators in particular, the idea of a business case gets kind of difficult for them because they may not be able to see how the work that they do on a day-to-day basis really aligns to the business and how it makes money. Well, your time is money. If you look at the work that you're doing, if there's any sort of process or task that you're doing that takes time away from other work that you could be doing, then that is costing your company money. In particular, if it's a repetitive process or if it's a remedial process, something breaks and you have to fix it. It breaks again and you have to fix it. Oh yeah, that thing broke, let's go fix it. If you know it's gonna break and you're spending time doing that, your company is losing money. So if you can't think of anything that sort of gives you a dollar value, think about your time and how your time could be better spent doing something else, and I guarantee you'll come to a business case that way. Okay, let's go on to our next step, sharing and collaborate. Unless you're working on a team of one, you have to get the word out. You got to talk to your other team members, and in particular, you want to share with your management. Now, for developers and system administrators, this might also be a difficult thing to do. Number one, it might be difficult to talk to management. Maybe you think that your manager or your seniors don't want to hear about changes in the environment that may potentially cost the company money to implement. A natural way to kind of make this happen is through one-on-one discussions. If you have the opportunity to talk one-on-one with your manager, definitely use that to broach the idea. Team meetings are also another good way to share the idea of a change in a natural setting with the other members of your team. You also want to find allies that are going to benefit from the change. And by allies, I mean people who are outside of your immediate team. So if you're a developer, for instance, that depends on system administrators to deploy your code, and you want to make a change in your deployment process, then you definitely want to bring those system administrators in on the idea of implementing a change. Vice versa, if you're an operator or an administrator and you want to change your infrastructure, but you have developers that are depending on that server being there, then you want to talk to them and say, hey guys, I'm thinking about doing something different with this approach. Now, even beyond that, you want to share the idea of change with other people that will benefit from the change being in place. So you might be thinking, well, I've already talked to my manager. I've already talked to my team. I've already talked to other people that, that I work closely with. If I'm an admin, I'm talking to my developers. Who else could benefit? Well, I'll give an example. If you're in charge of running the maintenance and administration for a web application, you may have marketing teams or business development teams that are keen on that site being up and always running 24/7. If there's some change that could benefit the site being up, then they want to know about that because that's how they're doing their job. That's how they're making sure the money is coming in. So definitely look beyond your immediate circle, even that next ring of people. Look even further into your company sphere of influence. It could even be a customer that's outside of your company that could benefit from the change. Now, another point that I like to share after I talk about sharing and collaborating is the idea that the world is a magical, beautiful place and we all just get along. As I've kind of shared this idea with people, they say, well, in all the instances you've done this, everybody's agreed. Everybody's happy. Everybody wants to change. When I tell people about change, I get feedback. I get problems. That may happen. And one of the things you might want to think about as you're considering the feedback that you're getting from people who are resistant to the idea of change is why they don't want things to change. And as I was doing a little bit of research on this, I came across this paper called Why Do People Still Love Manual Processes? And one of the key points in this paper that really kind of resonated with me is that we are knowledge workers, and a lot of time our work isn't necessarily visible. We can automate something so that we just, click something, we just type a couple commands, and there's a lot going on in the background. But if I have to type something out and print it out, get somebody to sign it, bring it back, read it, do something else, and then kind of iterate through this process, that's a show of me doing work. So, think about the approach that people may have to you coming to them and saying, hey, we need to make a change. They might like things the way that they already are. So that's just one thing to think about. It's not going to be all, rose-colored glasses and everything. There may be some resistance as you share your idea to make a change. All right, our next step. After we got everybody on board, hopefully, we're going to ease into the change as gently as possible. And the best way to do that is find the least disruptive way. We're not just going to pull the rug out from people and say, hey, the way that you were doing that yesterday, is going to change today. We're going to try to find the least disruptive way to implement the change. And second, we're going to build confidence and show value while we're making the change. Basically, we're going to take ownership. If something is going right, then we're going to communicate that to our circle, our spheres of influence. If something is going wrong, we're definitely going to say something right away and say, yeah, we tried to implement this change, it went wrong, we're going to fix it, and we're going to make sure it's right the next time. And as things are hopefully going along in the right direction, then we will iterate and repeat. Just starting small and then growing and growing and growing as we implement our change until the change is hopefully successfully implemented. Okay, so we got our toolbox. Building a business case, focusing on the pain points, sharing and collaborate with our allies, and finally, easing into the change by starting small. Okay, so we got our tools. Let's look at an example of how we can apply this. And again, one size doesn't fit all. This is just an example that I like to use of how this approach was used to implement a change. So the case study that we're going to look at is a deployment where the legacy process was a very manual deployment. And the goal is to get to a modern concept of automated deployment. Some might call it continuous integration, continuous deployment. I'm just going to say that this particular deployment will be automated. Okay, first, let me give you a little bit of background on the environment that this deployment is key to. So I'm going to let you look at that for a second. Okay, so if you're a web application developer, this might look like a pretty familiar architecture. You've got the internet coming into a load balancer, which feeds a cluster of servers. In this case, we have 3. Those 3 servers are connected to a single database. There's a code repository that holds the code, the application code that runs on these servers. And on the back end, somewhere on the network, there's an admin that kind of manages this whole infrastructure. Okay, so the developers make a change to the web app. And they say, hey, we want to deploy. Here's the URL for the code where it is on our Subversion server. Admin, deploy this code. Admin takes the URL. And he says, okay, well, we're doing sort of a canary deployment approach. So what we're going to do is I'm going to touch the load balancer and take this first server out of the balance. That's one step. We also need to clone the database in this particular case, because as we're deploying code to this server, it may include changes that affect the state of the data, and we don't want any changes to the database to affect the live application that's still running on the internet. So now we also need to change the connection to the server. We need to decouple server 1 from the original database and hook it up to the database clone. Now we can finally push some code out to that server. Okay, so the developers do their tests on this canary deployment. Everything looks good. Let's move on. Okay, so now we put server 1 into the balance, take server 2 and 3 out. What's the next step? Push the code out to, oh, wait a minute. No, we're not going to do that yet. We're going to first decouple the server 2 and server 3 from the database, and then we'll push the code out to those guys. Now we can put everything back into the balance, and we're running new code on all 3 servers, and our application is now at the next revision live on the internet. Oh, what about that database down there? Did we do anything with that, the old one? We'll just leave that there for a minute. We'll maybe get back to that. Oh, did I also mention that there are 3 exact environments like this? So 3 different web applications that have the same architecture running on some of the same hardware. Just keep that in mind as well. So let's look at this deployment process and what might go wrong with it. Well, historically, deployments to these applications, these 3 different applications, were done manually. Most of the steps were kind of done off the top of the head, typed into a shell by 1, maybe 2 admins. I think you can kind of see where there might be some problems there, because human error could definitely come into that. If your server naming convention is kind of similar across the board, you might just deploy the code to the wrong server. Oh man, I meant to put a S there instead of a P or something like that. And the code is now deployed to the wrong server. Or maybe as you're going through all these steps, cloning a database, taking a server out of a load balancer, making changes here, you might skip a step if you don't have a run book to follow. So if you have this kind of manual deployment process, you're having all these errors, if something goes wrong, not only is first of all, is your deployment going to take some time, but if you have any errors, then you're going to have to remediate those errors and kind of clean things up and get back to either a known state or finally the next state of the new application being deployed. If your site is down, or in this case, the web app is down, then usually they were losing revenue from lost ads. And as I said before, deployments are taking a long time to complete, 1 to 2 hours, and that's not including the time to recover any errors that took place. So we know what the initial state is. Let's talk about building a business case so that we can start making some changes to it. So as I said in our toolbox that was making our business case, we're going to focus on the pain points. In this particular case, the #1 problem was that bad deployments were causing downtime, and they were resulting in loss of revenue. So there's a clear connection to the business. If this application is not up and running, we're losing money, and downtime is being caused by bad deployments. So we can think, well, we could probably automate this process, and any automation that we have in place would eliminate or minimize errors, and hopefully they would speed up deployments as well. So we've got our business case, we kind of got our direction that we want to go in. We have a potential solution that we want to implement. Now let's get some metrics. Well, one good metric for this particular case was deployment frequency. And that is, how often are we deploying new changes to the application? Because if you know that the deployment is potentially going to be bad, you probably don't want to do any deployments. You don't want to break anything on purpose. And you also want to minimize the downtime in the event that you finally do make a deployment. So those are our two metrics that we're going to look at: deployment frequency and downtime. And I will say that the typical deployment frequency in this initial state was maybe monthly. We'll just go with that for now. Okay, so collaborating was our next step, sharing and collaborating. So in this case, I was an admin that was doing these manual deployments, and I was like, hey devs, we got to do something different. So let's collaborate, let's talk about this, let's make some changes. The first thing that we did was essentially a run book of the deployment. And let me tell you, that was an immediate improvement because it wasn't tribal knowledge anymore. We knew exactly what we needed to do to have a successful deployment, and it was all laid out in steps. Just having that document, not even having anything automated, still typing things into the command line, we had fewer errors. Our deployments were going faster because we didn't have to wait and think, oh, what's coming next? However, it was still a manual process. So I was still sitting there typing into the shell or clicking in a GUI to make changes. So our next goal was to automate, and my particular suggestion was to use a tool called Jenkins, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. No relation, by the way. So if you're familiar with Jenkins, then you know that it's an open source tool for building, deploying, and automating any project. And you can get some more information on the application at jenkins.io. So what I wanted to do was have a job. Basically, Jenkins breaks down its tasks in units called jobs. And I wanted to have a job that only had the deployment URL as a parameter, nothing else. Just give me the repository that you want to deploy from, and we'll start from there. Because if you recall, as we look at our environment, if you think about the initial state, we started our deployment with that input. The only input was the URL to the code, the repository where the web application code was hosted. So what if we took that out and we said, hey, Jenkins, here's the URL. I want you to deploy this code. We could script up all the steps. Jenkins now gets the code from the repository, and Jenkins does the code push to the servers. Based on the information that's coded in the repository URL, we can tell exactly what application we're deploying to and what servers are hosting that application. So again, we've implemented this, a Jenkins job with the URL as the only parameter. Now, in this particular implementation, remember, we're easing in, we're starting small. So Jenkins just did the push at the initial iteration. It just checked the code out and pushed it to the servers. It didn't do the complete deployment. There's still a lot of steps that needed to happen. However, because we did have documentation, we did have a run book, then we were able to automate those steps by scripting them, but they were still initiated manually. So we didn't have them running in Jenkins just yet, where we could just say, click Jenkins, go do it, and it did everything. We still would do the code push through Jenkins and then run a script to do the other steps, like taking the servers out of a load balancer, decoupling the database, and so on. So what were some of the results from this? Well, the number one main result from this one small change was that human error was eliminated at code push. That was one of the biggest problems that we had. Also, deployments became faster and much more dependable. They were faster because nobody was typing the code into the shell, and they were dependable because Jenkins was putting the code exactly where it needed to go. And also, our deployment frequency increased. We went from that monthly deployment to, I would say, maybe 2 or 3 deployments per month, which was definitely an improvement as far as I could tell. And also, our downtime did decrease. Because we had fewer errors at deployment, then we didn't have any problems with the deployments. They were very clean and very manageable, very predictable. Okay, so just in review, again, this tool that you can use to make changes in your environment, just starting with a business case, a reason that you need to make a change, and then in that business case, you want to be very specific on any pain that's being caused by that. Once you have that idea kind of crystallized, you want to share and collaborate first with your team, with any management that you need to get approval from, and beyond that, any people that are going to depend on that change. And then beyond that, any people that are going to benefit from that change. And that's where you're going to get those alliances. And finally, don't try to build Rome in a day. Just ease into it. Start small and be as unintrusive as possible. Now, with that, I'm pretty much done, so I would love to hear your questions. I'm going to say köszönöm to all of my friends here from Hungary. And if you want to get in touch with me later on, you can catch me on Twitter or on email at this particular information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful speech. And we already have some questions on Slido. Those of you who did not yet send your question to Slido, do it now. We still have some time. So, Michael, how would you inject modern concepts in an environment that dictates consistency across the application landscape?
It would really depend on what type of application you're talking about. My background and specialty is in web applications and keeping those up and running. And consistency, there's a couple different approaches you could use that. The first one, I would say, would be to freeze the environment. If you have an environment that is public-facing or and maybe caused by some changes, people changing passwords, data changing, that type of thing, then I would freeze the environment. You could throw up a maintenance page and say, hey, we're going to be offline for a little while. Disconnect the environment from the internet, and then make your changes that way, and then go back online.
Thank you. Such a movement there. Guys, if just out of respect, could you either do it super quiet or just stay in your places for 5 more minutes? Okay, so have you suggest automating deployments where change orders needed to be approved?
That's an interesting one because that requires manual intervention. Fortunately, and again, I'm a fan of Jenkins, no relation, but I love the tool. There is a plugin that allows a manual step. So what you could do is automate your process, and again, I'm using the example of using Jenkins. Automate your process and use that manual step to say, hey, we've reached this point in the deployment. Shoot off an email to someone to say, hey, we need your approval, we need permission to go forward, and that person can reply. They can go into the application and click the button that says, yes, proceed to the next step. And that way you can automate to a point, but also include that manual interaction as well. Cool.
During database cloning and deployment, new data can be created. Any process to take it?
That's a very difficult one to handle, particularly if you're in an environment that requires that database to be online, as long as the application is online while you're doing your deployment. But again, if you have the opportunity to freeze the environment in any way, to say no changes can be made while we're deploying this application, then that's the best approach. The second approach would be to do a data migration. As your new application is deployed, maybe if you're doing a database clone, then you're syncing or merging the data, any changes from the old database to the new database.
I wish I would understand that. I hope you guys did. How do you overcome the fears of automation and configuration management? That is, Puppet will replace me or Jenkins will run wild and destroy things?
I sincerely hope that I can automate myself out of a job. Number one, I'm going to have fun doing it because, at least in the current state, I know AI, if there's anybody out there working on AI, you guys are scaring me every day because computers and the systems that they kind of run on are getting smarter and smarter. Cars are going to be driving themselves in no time, right? So, but until we get to that day, there are still people that have to program the automation to take place. So I don't think Puppet is going to replace us. I think it's just going to enable us to do more work and to do more work smarter.
You just want to go surfing, don't you?
Yeah, I just want to hit the beach.
There you go. What do you think is the role for admins after enabling developers to run these processes themselves?
Well, that's a very good point because I think we're getting to, well, we've already gotten to a place where developers can manage the automation, or I should say, developers can manage the infrastructure themselves. So if developers are managing the infrastructure, what's an admin, what's an operator to do? Well, I think we can only free ourselves up to get smarter about the way that we're managing our infrastructure. We can look for ways to minimize costs. I know there's talks here that are talking about serverless. Maybe we can start, studying those types of approaches to save money for the company. Anytime you have a sharp system administrator and you give them more time to learn new things, then you're just going to have a better environment.
And then you go to the beach surfing
And then
again.
you have more time to go to the beach.
What do you suggest in highly controlled environments where manual documentation has to be applied all the time, like for audit or so?
For an audit, or I should say an audited environment, one of the benefits of using automation as opposed to using a manual process is that you can generate logs. So if you are in an environment where you need to audit every step that's taking place, I would say as you're automating your process, to log those steps. And log those steps in such a way that they are unchangeable. There's a lot of different tools out there. I can't really think of any right off the top of my head. In AWS, you might use CloudTrail or something like that so that you can log steps and you can use that for your audit down the road.
Thank you. How do you compare the direct cost of change that is outside contractors to non-measurable costs of pain points like wasted time?
That's a difficult one to answer. Again, wasted time is relative depending on how you look at it. But any time that is wasted at work is costing the company money. So, yeah, that's a tough one to answer. In particular, working with contractors, if you've hired contractors, management would expect those contractors to almost be working 24/7 around the clock nonstop because they're paying for every single minute of their time. So yeah, that's a difficult one to answer. So I'm going to pass if you'll give me a pass on that.
Ask Michael during coffee. And then what is
Yeah.
wasted time? When you go surfing, is it wasted time or not?
Surfing is never wasted time. No.
A last one. Are you familiar with the concept of legacy in a box? If yes, can you talk about how you used it?
Actually, yes, I can. There was one particular situation where we were modernizing an infrastructure, and there was a very, very legacy application. I'm talking about 1980s application, and this was 2 or 3 years ago. And basically what we had to do was pick up this application that was running on Red Hat 3, and we had a requirement to be on the latest Red Hat at the time. I think it might have been 7. So through blood, sweat, and tears, we picked up this legacy application, shoved it into a Red Hat 7 VM, and said, this is going to be our kind of our golden image. If anything, we go forward from there, we're just going to use this image. Because long-term release on Red Hat 7 at the time, we could go forward with that. A better approach, I think, would have been to taken that environment, legacy application, legacy operating system, Red Hat 3, and shoved it into some sort of application container. Then we could have taken that application container and put it on any environment, anywhere, and that would have been a much more portable solution. However, we didn't have any sort of application container infrastructure at the time, so we had to go with the VM approach.
Okay, that one even I understood. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
And while you upload for Michael, I will bring his portrait.
Thank you, guys.